Good morning, everybody. I woke up to 10,000 subscribers. Sincere thanks. That means a lot to me. Um, I've worked really hard to try to make the content better, more engaging, and more thorough as I've gone. I've been learning how to do this. It's a different skill set than just knowing how to fix something. But your support has meant the world to me, and it keeps me from feeling like a madman talking to myself while I work on magic boxes. A good local client was interested in buying this TopHat Super Deluxe Mark II from a local music store, and he asked if I would, if I thought it was a good amp or a bad amp, and I said I don't have any experience with this model, but I'd be glad to take a look and see if there are any hidden gotchas before you buy it. And as I'm friends with both the client and the owner of said music store, it was not a big deal, so I took it home, and we're gonna open it up and see how it was built and whether it's something I could recommend to someone. And remember, I don't know anything about this model yet. The owner said that it came you can use either 6V6 or 6L6 or EL34 output tubes. These are EL34s. I would assume, never assume, but it's a pretty good bet that this thing's going to be cathode biased to make swapping tubes that easy. Though I'll check. It may be fixed bias with adjustable settings. It's got 3 at least, might be more. I just see the 3 preamp tubes. They're all 3 Tungsol 12AX7s. It's got EL34s in it now. It's got a tube rectifier, has 2 easily accessible fuses right by the IAC connector. So you can get in there and unplug it if necessary, though usually it'll just stay screwed to the side of the cabinet. But it should be easy to change fuses. Just be careful not to burn your fingers touching the rectifier tube if you do it while the amp's been on. Of possible concern, it's got a G12H30, which is a great sounding speaker and a great choice usually for a open back 1x12 cabinet. Depending on the output of the amplifier, which is going to involve bias and the voltages, I'm a little concerned if it takes a pair of EL34s or a pair of 6L6s with that 30 watt rating. But if it's cathode biased, this is probably 24 watt amp. So it could be fine. Anyway, let's take this chassis out of the cabinet so we can see what makes it tick. Before I do that, I want to disconnect the speaker cable. It's connected to the 4 ohm tap. I'll confirm that that is correct before I put it back together. I'll disconnect the IC cable. And down here, there's a little bulb which lights up the TopHat front logo. And that has a quick connect here. Let's see if this quick connect actually comes apart easily. Very good. Some amp manufacturers put goop on that, just adhesive. It makes it really difficult to detach, especially when you can't really see what you're doing inside a cabinet. So they got that right. Alrighty, here, let's get my tools ready. Number 2 screwdriver, and I always start these by hand, then I'll go to the power tool. By the way that they're turning, I think we're probably going to find threaded inserts, and these are going to be machine screws. I spoke too soon. I also need to remove these screws. All right, the front panel, you have on, you have standby, power light, master, cut, that's going to be the Vox cut control, bass, mid, treble, gain, padded and not padded inputs. Pretty standard stuff. There's a 3-way boost. It says fat, off, bright. Very Art Deco labels. It's hard to read what the bright one said at first. There's not a really good way to do this. You don't want to put too much pressure on the screws. Sometimes it's better if it's hanging down. Sometimes it's better if it's on the side. What I'm actually going to do is take this box and wedge it in here on that side first and back that nut out. I know you can't see this. It's a screw going this way and a nut on the inside with a tooth washer. And unlike a lot of amps, the contact point for that tooth washer and nut is not on an overlapped part of the chassis, so that's good. It's got a clean bit of flat metal for all that to go to. I'll show that. I guess I'll show that now before I take it out. This side I can take out now that I've got it supported at this end with my hand and the other end with that box. As you can see here, behind that tooth washer, it's flat. A lot of chassis, see that overlap on the, it's hard to do this upside down and backwards. See how that overlap is here? A lot of chassis do the overlap the other way, and then you end up having those bolts and hardware on two different planes. So this is much better. All right, let's look through this app. There's some things I'm going to mention that will seem nitpicky, but that is literally my job. So the nitpicks are going to be focused on details, and that's going to fall in the good and bad category. Number one, the AC safety ground is going with a green wire directly to a terminal strip, not a terminal strip, a ground lug right here at the chassis. But there's a second ground lug as well, and there are 3 grounds made here. One ground, aha, okay, I could barely see it, it's right here. There's a capacitor to ground off the main DC, and that cap is there to take some stress off that standby switch. In the Morgan video, I mentioned that when you have the standby between a tube rectifier and the first filter cap stage, it stresses the rectifier because that cap is at is basically a short for a few milliseconds when you first power the amp on or first take it out of standby. By having this capacitor here, this takes some of that shock off the rectifier tube. And that's good and bad, except that it's a Mallory 150M, which is not rated for such a purpose. It's probably okay. It's not a capacitor that should have been spec'd for this purpose. And then the HT center tap goes to ground here as well. Safety code means that this capacitor and this HT center tap should be at chassis here, and the AC safety ground should have its own chassis connection. And that's not me, that's safety code. Does that make a difference to the owner? Probably not, but it's not safety code. And the reason is the AC safety ground needs to be immune from anything else coming loose, and it needs to be severely over tightened, etc., etc. Anyway, next they have the hot going to the fuse, but they have it going to the wrong side of the fuse holder, which means that when you pull the fuse out, if the amp were to be plugged in, you could potentially get zapped a little bit because you'd be touching the metal part which is tied to here. This is not a code, but it should be. The hot should go to the inmost connection on a fuse holder. Other than that, that's fine. And then they have an HT fuse after the rectifier tube, before or after the standby. I can't tell yet from this angle. Going down the line, very neat wiring throughout. The grid stoppers are mounted to the side of the output tubes, so the heat from the tubes will affect them less. That's good. The screen grids share same one resistor. It is 750 ohm from what I can tell. Let me make sure that's the proper one. Where is that connected? Yeah, it's a 750 ohm screen, which also serves as the choke in this amp, I believe. Let me make sure of that. Yeah, so 750 ohm is giving you a choke function. It's a 10 watt, it's a good resistor. And it's giving the equivalent of two 1.4K screen grids for each tube. It's a philosophy of amp design that was popular in a lot of earlier amps, and this is replicating that. Then I can tell here that this amp is indeed cathode biased. So it has got a 270 ohm resistor with a 50 microfarad, 50 volt cap across it. So yeah, you can put 6L6s, EL34s in here. Won't hurt that G12H 30 watt speaker. I'm not convinced that it's the best sounding option to be able to change output tubes to such a degree, because you really want to have a certain output transformer primary impedance for a certain set of tubes. It's safe to mismatch. Just know that it will not. A lot of the sound differences you're going to get if you go from, say, 6v6s to EL34s are not going to be because the tubes changed. The actual signal that the tubes want to put out would be fairly similar in a lot of ways. And that's not a blanket statement, but as generalities go, it's a truth. But these output tubes would behave very differently, 6v6s or EL34s or 6L6s, based on their reaction with the primary impedance, reflected impedance of the output transformer. And that might be something that could be played around with by intentionally mismatching 8 and 4 ohm outputs. I'll look at that after I've done a bit more math. The rest of it seems pretty simple and straightforward. Good heater wiring going here. Very, very neat wiring going to the pots. All Teflon coated 22 gauge stranded, looks like, which is one of my favorite things to use as well. Very neat wiring of a micro ground bus, which makes a lot of sense. Keeps all the grounds neat and structurally supported, but it's all going to a point right by the inputs. So that's good, and there's not a ground loop with that. So that's a great implementation of a ground bus wire. Looks to be 18 or 20 gauge. Some people like to use 16 or 14. Some monsters out there like to use 12 gauge. The only difference is if you go to the really big gauges, it can be harder to get a good solder joint because you have to heat things up so much. And you end up, it's harder to build the first time. It's harder to get good solder connections, and it's really hard to service because of the heat dissipation issue as well. This smaller gauge stuff, I think it's 18, is more than adequate for the current there. I mean, it's just fine. And you can get good clean solder joints, and it's easier to service down the road. It's easier to build the first time. Let's see how the master volume is implemented, because the wires to it are going a long way over here. All right, so this is like a JCM 800. You've got the volume, you've got the tone stack. The output of the tone stack goes all the way over here to the master. It's got this felt here so that these wires don't vibrate against the chassis. That's a nice touch. Then there's a straight Vox cut circuit here. As far as the preamp wiring goes, it's a combination of 1 watt carbon films, seemingly mostly on the plates, and 1/2 watt carbon composites. It's got all Sprague atom caps in here. Those are fine. It's got Mallory 150Ms for the larger film coupling caps. It's got no negative feedback. It's very much taking a lot of cues from the AC15 in the output section. It's got these caps here. I can never remember which poly they are. Polystyrene, small value caps, which are really good sounding. They're getting harder to find. They can be very prone to microphonics, hence that little bit of silicone here. Notice that unlike other amps, there's very little silicone in the amp. There's a little bit here to hold this plate wire to the chassis, and there's a little bit here on each of these caps just to keep them from becoming microphonic. The only downside of these caps, besides the availability, microphonics, and price, is that the leads on them are very fragile. So if you build an amp with one of these and you're used to using silver micas or something, go easy and make sure that if you're soldering one of these in place, you don't just solder it. You want to put a heat sink between the solder point and the body of the cap, because these things will die if they get overheated. I have no faults of the way this amp is built, except for one caveat, that because of the way this amp is built, and I'm seeing multiple wraps around some of the connections. Some of the connections have a 270-degree wrap, which means it's not a full wrap, but it's the mil spec. And some of them have more than that. This amp can be very difficult to service when it will need service eventually. You know, these Mallories may never need to be changed. Eventually, say this probably 47K tail resistor there will need to be changed. And when that happens, you've got to unwrap those leads. Now, if that's the only thing you have to do in the amp, it's not a huge deal. What would normally take 2 minutes might take 10. But if you have to do 4 or 5 things in here, and so let's say you had to make 5 changes in this amp 20 years down the road, and they would normally take 2 minutes, that makes a 10-minute job, and then they take 10 minutes each, take an hour. So it just adds up to the repair, number one, in terms of the time. Number two, you have to have someone very skilled to repair these well, otherwise it'll come out looking like a dog's dinner. Now, I'm going to measure that tail resistor in the phase inverter. I think it's a 47K. For those of you who have only recently found my channel, I am red-green colorblind, and resistor stripes and I don't get along. Measures 52.2K, but I think it started off life as a 47. That's within the range of the tolerance range you might find in a carbon composite. That tail resistor in a phase inverter sees things, man. So I'll be confirming that it's operating correctly soon. The filter caps here, you can't see where I'm pointing. The filter caps here and then down here are another place where the eventual labor will be difficult, because you say you want to change that cap there, you got to remove the whole thing. But as far as a true point-to-point, true hand-wired, skillfully done amp goes, this seems very good. So far, the only real problems I've seen are the AC safety ground and how that fuse holder is wired. And I'm not going to change the AC safety ground because it's more a theoretical thing, but it should not be wired the way it was in a commercial product. I will change the fuse wiring. Let me show that again. Just reverse these 2 wires so that if my client buys this amp, or someone's going to buy this amp and use this amp, and they change fuses and they forget to unplug from the wall, they're not going to get zapped. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do a hardware tightening check. It's just all too common for things to vibrate loose over time. So I'm going to start with the output transformer. That is really tight. That's good. That's really tight. That's good. Let's check the power transformer connections. Now this is really crucial because the nuts which hold the power transformer to the chassis are also holding these ground points. These often come loose on old fenders. Let's see how they're doing on this. This was built in 10 of 16, so this amp's only 6 years old. Had a little bit of movement. And this one over here, which has the AC safety ground, the HT ground, and the ground for that cap on the rectifier. A little bit of movement. And this one, a little bit of movement. What happens is transformers weigh a lot, and even a steel chassis like this, over time, flexes a little bit from the weight, and things are cycling with heat. This area is getting hot. This one, I'm going to have to get a different tool because the lamp holder is right where I would... actually, I might be able to... No, let me get a different tool. I can't use the socket from the top on that one. All right, that feels good. All right, I'm going to do the same thing. All the chassis connections for these terminal strips. This is an excellently built amp. Please don't take all my little observations as attacks on the amp. I have no need to criticize things. I have a need for things to be beyond, either be beyond criticism, which this amp almost is aside from the wiring down by the fuses, or to be beyond unrealistic expectations at a certain price point. All right, so now the same stuff I do on every amp. Just because things work loose over time, I'll make sure the input jacks are tight. It could be tightened a little bit. I'm going to check the gain pot for the same reason. And if it has any movement, I'm going to have to do that on all these others as well as soon as I find my screwdriver. All right, so we're just going to loosen this one and see if that pot is tight. Yeah, it feels good. Unless I observe a problem in operation of any of these others, I'm not going to do the same thing. They feel okay. All right, so let me do a little bit of dusting on this top panel, just because life happens. So I've got the treble turned down to minimum and the gain turned down to minimum. I'll just match that. I want to see if it's sitting the same place. All right, it's sitting on the same plane as the others already. Some amps, they'll rest against the panel, and you have to elevate them. If that's the case, I used various stackings of guitar picks to get thickness like this one. This one gets me 1.14 millimeter. This medium is about a 0.7 millimeter. You just stack guitar picks. So just try to line that up, tighten it up. I'm just going to set all these controls to noon, except for the gain, for when I do the power up test. Make sure the output jacks are tight, because that's how grounds are made. The 4 was a little bit less than perfect. Normally I would make sure that these screws on these octals are tight. They actually have these washers for vibration, which means that you can never fully tighten them, but they're also very unlikely to vibrate loose. I'm going to confirm the value of the speaker because it was connected to the 4 ohm tap. As I expected, it's an 8 ohm speaker. Very few people would put a 4 ohm 1x12 out in the world. 8 ohm makes a lot more sense. In theory, it should be connected to the 8 ohm load, but I'm going to have to look at the mismatch and sound from using 34s versus, say, 6v6s in this cathode biased amp. And it may sound better with that mismatch just because of the primary impedance tricks. And I described that in more extent in a video a week or two ago on that SL Amps Custom Clean, if you want to know more about that subject. All right, before we put the tubes in and power it back up, let's make sure that the fuses are tight. Shut up, meter. Turn it off. And are the correct values. So it says 2 amp and half amp. That's pretty typical for an amp like this. I had to flip them around so the legible part was sticking out. So 2 amp, it's a good one. Let's put it in place. And this one, again, flip it around so the value is visible. Half amp. There it goes. All right, I'm gonna go make another pot of coffee, and then we'll put the tubes in, and power it up. We'll see what the cathode bias is actually set to, and we'll see how it sounds.